Tonight, a building. It took roughly 200 years to make, in the middle of Paris, on an island in a river. That is long enough that a man could be born on the site, work there all his life, and die with the thing still unfinished, and many did. It is a true story. There is nothing frightening in it and nothing you need to hold on to. No dates will be asked of you. Let the numbers go past. We are here for the sound of chisels and the smell of stone dust, and for the fact that it is quite all right to fall asleep. Paris in the 1100s is smaller than you are picturing. Perhaps 50,000 people, growing fast. At its center is an island in the Seine, and on the eastern end of that island stands the cathedral. Not the one you know. An older church, dedicated to Saint Stephen, with another church beside it, both a few centuries old by then, both getting shabby and, more to the point, both too small. The bishop at the time was a man named Maurice de Sully. He had come from a poor family in the countryside and risen through the schools of Paris, which was itself becoming famous for its teachers. He decided to clear the whole eastern end of the island and build something new. Not just larger. Different. A church of a kind that had only existed for about 20 years, at that point, in a handful of places north of Paris. Taller than anything in the city, lit from all sides, with walls that were more window than wall. Work began around the year 1163. Nobody wrote down a completion date, because nobody expected to need one. The idea they were reaching for was light. That sounds like a modern gloss, but it is not. The people commissioning these buildings wrote about it directly. An abbot named Suger, at Saint Denis just north of Paris, had rebuilt part of his abbey church a couple of decades earlier and had inscriptions carved about the brightness of the new work and how the mind rises through material things towards immaterial ones. Whether the Masons shared the theology is another matter, but they certainly shared the goal, because it was an interesting engineering problem. A stone roof is heavy. It pushes outwards as well as downwards. Traditionally, you resisted that with thick walls and small windows. If you want big windows, you must take the weight somewhere else. The answer was to gather the roof's load onto ribs, and the ribs onto piers, and then to catch the outward push with arms of stone reaching in from separate supports outside the building. Flying buttresses. Notre-Dame was one of the first churches to use them at real scale, and you can still see them from the riverbank, a row of thin stone arcs holding the walls up from a polite distance. Before any of that, though, there is a quarry. The stone is a pale, fine limestone that formed under a warm shallow sea about 45 million years ago, and it lies under Paris and the country just south of it. It has a lovely property for builders. When freshly cut, it is relatively soft, full of quarry sap, and can be worked with hand tools without much fuss. Left in the air, it hardens. So it is easy when you need it easy and firm when you need it firm. It came out of quarries on the left bank and from the countryside beyond, in blocks, on ox carts and river barges. Getting it to the island was the expensive part. A rule of thumb from the period is that transport could cost more than the stone itself if you carried it far, which is why builders used water wherever they could. The tunnels those quarries left are still under Paris. Some are the catacombs. So the city stands, quite literally, on the hole that the cathedral came out of. Choosing the stone was part of the craft. Different beds in the quarry gave different qualities. A hard, dense stone for the piers and the base courses where the loads were greatest. A softer, finer stone higher up, where a carver needed to cut foliage and faces without the material fighting him. A master mason who could not read a quarry face was no use at all, and much of the knowledge was carried in the head rather than written down anywhere. Now, the site. Imagine it as a workshop rather than a building site. There is a lodge, a covered wooden shed where the masons work, warm enough in winter to keep the mortar and the hands going. There is a tracing floor, a smooth surface of plaster where full-size details of arches and moldings are drawn out, and from those drawings wooden templates are cut, and the templates go to the men at the benches. There is a master mason, who is the closest thing to an architect and who is also a working craftsman. There are stone cutters, called bankers because of the benches they sat at. There are setters who place the finished blocks. Carpenters, and they are as important as anyone, because everything is held up by wood before it is held up by stone. Mortar makers. Laborers. Carters. A blacksmith, working full-time, because chisels blunt constantly on limestone and need resharpening several times a day. And a clerk keeping accounts, because everybody here is being paid. That is worth pausing on for a moment. There is a lovely popular image of cathedrals being built by devout townspeople volunteering their labor for the glory of God. It happened occasionally, and there is a famous account from Chartres of people hauling carts of stone. But it was unusual enough that it got written about, which tells you something. The ordinary reality was payroll. Cathedral building was a large, long-running employment scheme funded by the church's revenues, by the bishop's income, by donations, by gifts in wills, by pilgrim offerings. Money arrived unevenly, and so work went in bursts. A good decade of income meant scaffolding everywhere. A bad one meant a skeleton crew keeping the tarpaulins on. You can read this in the fabric of the building if you know how to look. Notre-Dame's nave has places where the design changes partway up, where a later master mason took over and did things his own way, or where a decision was revised. It is not a single design executed. It is a conversation between generations, conducted in stone, with each speaker slightly correcting the last. Here is the detail I like most, and it is very small. Go into the older parts of many medieval cathedrals, look closely at the individual blocks, particularly in places nobody was meant to admire, and you will find little cut symbols. A cross with a hook. A zigzag. An arrow. A shape like a comb. These are banker marks. Each stonecutter had his own, and he cut it into every block he finished. The reason was money. Masons were paid by the piece, so the clerk needed to know whose work was whose when it came to counting. There is also a practical quality control side. A bad block could be traced back. But the effect, 800 years later, is unintentionally moving. These are signatures. Not artist signatures, not proud ones, just an accounting mark. We do not know most of these men's names, and we never will. But we can identify individual hands. We can say, this man cut these 40 stones, in this part of the wall, and then he stopped, and someone else's mark appears. A whole working life, legible as a symbol, hidden inside a wall where it was never meant to be read. The lifting was done with wood and muscle and patience. The great tool was the treadwheel crane. A large wooden wheel, wide enough for a man to stand inside, sometimes two, who walked steadily forward so that the wheel turned and the rope wound onto its axle. Because the wheel is large and the axle small, a couple of men could raise a block weighing a ton, slowly. And slowly is the correct word for all of it. Mortar of that period took a very long time to reach full strength, so you could not simply keep piling stone upwards at speed. Builders often stopped a course, let the winter pass, and returned. Arches and vaults were built over wooden formwork called centering, elaborate temporary structures shaped to the exact curve of the finished stone, and after the stones were set the centering stayed in place for months before the carpenters carefully lowered it and everyone watched to see if the arch would stand on its own. It almost always did. Occasionally it did not, and they built it again. Almost none of this was written down at the time, which is why one surviving document is treasured. A 13th-century Frenchman named Villard de Honnecourt kept a small parchment notebook, 30-odd leaves, filled with sketches, church plans, a lion drawn from life, a device for keeping a sculpted angel's finger pointing at the sun, notes on how to measure the height of a tower without climbing it. It is not a manual. It is a working man's scrapbook, and it is about as close as we get to sitting in the lodge with them. Above the stone vaults, out of sight, was the roof, and it was a forest. That is the nickname it acquired, La Forêt, and it was accurate. The frame of Notre-Dame's roof was a dense lattice of oak beams, hundreds of them, 1,300 or so, from an estimated 1,000 or more trees. Some of those trees were felled in the 1160s and 1170s, which means they had been growing since perhaps the 800s. The timbers were shaped with axes rather than saws, and the joints were cut and pegged, and once the roof was closed, almost nobody went up there again except workmen. It sat in the dark for 8 centuries. Carpenters who studied it before 2019 described it as astonishingly economical, with beams sized precisely to their loads by men who had no mathematics for it and simply knew. In April 2019 a fire began in the roof and that forest burned, and the spire above it fell. The stone vaults, doing exactly what they were designed to do, held. Most of the building beneath was saved. While we are correcting things gently, 2 more. The first is the spire. The tall, elegant spire that everyone pictures at the center of the roof was not medieval. There had been a medieval one, but it had grown unstable and was taken down in the 1780s. The one that stood until 2019 was designed in the 1850s by Eugene Viollet-le-Duc, during a great restoration prompted partly by Victor Hugo's novel, which had made Parisians look at their neglected cathedral again. Viollet-le-Duc also gave us many of the gargoyles and grotesques people think of as ancient. They are not fakes exactly. They are a 19th century idea of the Middle Ages, which is a real and interesting thing in its own right. The second correction is about our own favorite phrase. We often say the builders knew they would never see it finished. That is partly true and partly not. The choir was consecrated and in use around 1182, less than 20 years in. People were worshipping in a working cathedral for generations while construction carried on around them. It was not an empty site awaiting completion. It was always in use, always half done. So the timeline, loosely. Ground broken about 1163. The choir finished and consecrated by 1182. The nave through the next decades. The west front, the great facade with its 2 towers, rising through the 1220s and 30s, the towers topped out by around 1250. Then the transepts rebuilt and enlarged, with their enormous rose windows, in the 1250s and 60s, by masters whose names we do have, Jean de Chelles and Pierre de Montreal. Chapels added between the buttresses through the rest of the century. So, begun under one king, more or less complete under his great-great-grandson. And then never really finished at all, because a cathedral is not a finished object. It is a thing that requires attention forever. Every generation since has repaired it, altered it, damaged it, restored it. It has been a church, a stripped-out revolutionary temple, a warehouse, a coronation hall, a building site, and a church again. It reopened in December 2024 with a new oak roof, cut with axes, in the medieval way, by carpenters who wanted to do it properly. They went into the forests of France and chose individual oaks, several thousand of them, and felled them in winter when the sap was down, and squared them with hand axes rather than machines, because a hand-axed beam has a slightly compressed surface that sheds water better than a sawn one. That is the sort of thing a 13th century carpenter knew, and a 21st century one had to work out again. Somewhere inside those walls tonight there is a block of pale limestone with a small scratched symbol on the side of it, facing inwards, where nobody can see. A man cut it so he would be paid at the end of the week. He has been gone for 800 years and the mark is still there, holding up a roof. Sleep well. The work will still be going on in the morning. It always is.